We are going to now discuss control of hormone secretion. This is not just going to be an easy one-way pathway. We have three different ways in which we can stimulate hormonal secretion, hormone secretion. So most of our hormones are controlled by a negative feedback system. If you don't really remember what this was, we talked about it in AMP1, or maybe you've discussed it in a previous biology course, but let's review real quick. So we get some type of stimulus that will go to a sensor that will tell our control center something is off. And then that control center will speak to the effector and tell it to correct that change. And that change, once it's done, will then go back to the stimulus portion so that it is maintained more at homeostasis. So let's discuss a example so this just makes a little bit more sense. So let's say our stimulus, this is more of a simple example by the way, but our stimulus would be our body temperature is going to exceed 35 degrees Celsius. I know it's hard to imagine right now because we are all so tired of winter and ready for some heat, but let's say our body temp rises above the homeostasis level. It's going to go over to our sensor right over here, which would represent our nerve cells within our skin and the brain, and that will cause our temperature regulatory center within our brain to say, hey, we need to do something about this increased temperature in our body. So then it goes over to our effector organ. In this case, it would be the sweat glands throughout our body. Tell it to secrete some fluid, some sweat, and that sweat evaporating off of our skin will cool our body down. Then a signal will go back to our stimulus, whatever, or sensor, whatever is first picking up that information that something is off homeostasis, and we'll tell it, hey, we are back to our homeostasis level. You don't need to send the signal that we are too warm over to our control centers. So that feedback of sending that information back and letting them know, hey, we're back at our homeostasis level, that is how a negative feedback system works. And we will go through so many examples of this, especially when we get into chapter 18 and the endocrine organs. So now let's talk about the different stimuli for hormone secretion. We are not going to secrete hormones at a constant rate most of the time, and instead we use these three methods. We have humoral stimuli, neural stimuli, and hormonal stimuli. So be careful on your exam when you read, don't mix up humoral and hormonal because they have similar letters within the word, so it's easy to read through them incorrectly. So first we'll start off with humoral stimuli. Humoral, I want you to think of fluid because the anatomists or scientists back centuries ago used to think inside our body was made up of a bunch of humors or fluid. It wasn't until they started dissecting corpses that they realized that was not the case. So we want to think of circulation when we think of humoral stimuli. And what this stimulus is changing different concentrations within our blood, concentrations of ions or nutrients that will stimulate the secretion of our hormones. So let's talk about an example. In our blood, we have a homeostasis level of a concentration of calcium. Let's say that dips down just a bit. So then we are going to sense that decrease in calcium concentration within our blood, and that triggers our parathyroid glands, which we find posterior to our thyroid gland, to secrete the parathyroid hormone. Now, what does our parathyroid hormone do? It is going to, I'm going to skip down to this picture, it is going to activate our osteoclasts to resorb the bone and release that calcium into our blood so that it increases blood calcium levels so that it is back to homeostasis. Now, if we have high calcium in our blood, then our parathyroid hormone would not be secreted and the osteoclast would be inactivated so that we get decreased blood calcium levels. Now let's talk about neural stimuli. We have nerve fibers that can stimulate hormone release from specific endocrine glands. The example here that we are going to mention involves our sympathetic nervous system, remember fight or flight, and also our adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal medulla. I know we haven't talked about the urinary system yet, we haven't gotten into this as an endocrine gland just yet, but on our adrenal gland we have two layers. We have the cortex, which is the periphery over here, and then the darker portion on the inside is the medulla. So the way these fibers travel is they start in our spinal cord, and we send out preganglionic sympathetic nerve system fibers and go over to a sympathetic or course through a sympathetic ganglion, which we'll discuss next quarter what that is exactly, and head over to our medulla of the adrenal gland. In this medulla, we have norepinephrine and epinephrine, which we can classify as catecholamines, and those are released then into our blood to give us our fight or flight response that we want. So this image over here is just showing you how the nerve impulse is going to travel. So here was our cell body. That nerve impulse travels through. Nerve impulse, by the way, is the same thing as an action potential. So our action potential, or AP, is traveling through, and then we can have either stimulatory neurotransmitters like epinephrine, or we can have certain nerves that give more of an inhibitory neurotransmitter being released. So if we have a stimulatory neurotransmitter being released to our endocrine cell, then that cell will secrete another hormone into our bloodstream. Whereas if we have an inhibitory neurotransmitter being secreted, then the endocrine cell will not secrete the hormone. The last stimulus we have is a hormonal stimulus. So this means that we are going to have one hormone stimulate another. So an example of this, and we will talk through this pathway a little bit more in chapter 18, we will have hormones secreted by the hypothalamus, which will travel down to, in this example, the anterior pituitary gland. And cells here can secrete hormones such as the thyroid stimulating hormone to our thyroid gland. It can secrete our ACTH to our adrenal cortex, or it can secrete LH or FSH over to the gonads. So don't worry so much about what those hormones I mentioned are just yet. We will discuss them, but know that a hormone's traveling from the anterior pituitary gland to another endocrine organ, and that causes each of these endocrine organs to secrete a corresponding hormone. Okay. So this then will work within a feedback loop. So let's say we have our anterior pituitary gland secreting thyroid stimulating hormone over to our thyroid gland. Our thyroid gland then secretes the thyroid hormones, T4 and T3. But let's say we get a increased amount of these hormones. We should have a feedback loop that will signal back to the anterior pituitary gland, and it will also signal back to the hypothalamus to stop secreting their hormones. So if our anterior pituitary gland stops or it's not going to completely stop, but it reduces the amount of thyroid stimulating hormone that is being secreted to the thyroid gland, then I'm going to reduce the amount of T3 and T4 that I'm secreting from the thyroid gland.